So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and welcome to this Beatitude Center Zoom session with our very special guest today, my friend Kathy Kelly. A couple of preliminaries, and then we'll do a little prayer, and then I'll introduce Kathy and then hand over the session to her. So first, again, let me invite you all to mute yourselves and to stay muted, please, so that we can hear Kathy. And on the other hand, to write down questions or comments in the Zoom link for Kathy. Now, I really, really, really want to encourage you to ask Kathy Kelly a question. She's one of the great peacemakers. This is a great opportunity, given everything that's happening in the world, to unpack your concerns and questions with our great teacher. Again, I'm hoping Kathy will speak for 45 minutes or so, or longer if you want, whatever's good. And then we'll have the rest of the time for questions and comments and discussions. We're going to go an hour and a half. And on Monday, we, the Beatitude Center, will send out the Zoom recording link, and you can listen to it again if you want. So I just invite us to begin with a little 2-second prayer. So if you'd like to just, sit up and take a deep breath and take a moment of silence, and let's enter into the presence, the God of peace, who loves each one of you infinitely, and each one of us, the whole human race, infinitely. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus of the Beatitudes into our circle and ask for whatever graces of peace we need for ourselves. And let's ask for the grace of discernment and peace for the whole human race. So we'll take a moment of silence, and then I'll offer a little prayer. God of peace, be with us now as we reflect with our friend Kathy on your call to be peacemakers in this world of violence and war. Inspire us, disarm us, heal us, renew us, strengthen us, and send us forth like Kathy to do our part to make peace in the world, to love our enemies, to spread disarmament, and to welcome your reign of peace and nonviolence here on earth. We ask this blessing in the name of the nonviolent Jesus. Amen. Amen, everybody. So, here we are, as the world is on the brink of another war, this time with Ukraine, which has been under permanent war. And the news yesterday that the Biden administration is going to withhold its billions for relief to the suffering people of Afghanistan. And as you know, I consider that the world we live in is a world of permanent warfare and total violence, and that we're moving closer and closer to nuclear war. And because of our permanent war on Mother Earth, we've now unleashed the beginnings of catastrophic climate change. So that's why it's such a blessing to have the person I consider the greatest peacemaker in the United States with us. I've been saying that about her for 40 years. And Kathy Kelly has been speaking out against war and nuclear weapons for a long time, certainly for well over 40 years. She's been in prison for anti-nuclear action demonstrations, and started traveling to Iraq, I would say probably in the 90s, and went many, many, many times to Iraq and speaking out against the US war in Iraq. In the 2000s, she started traveling again regularly to Afghanistan. She coordinated my own trip to Kabul. She's an author, a well-known public speaker, the founder of Voices in the Wilderness, which later became Voices for Creative Nonviolence. We've been arrested and jailed together many times. Very happy events, because once you get in jail with Kathy Kelly, she just reverts to her Irish roots and starts singing these strange Irish songs and doing Irish jigs and cheering everybody up. But one of the highlights of our resistance was the Creech 14, which was the first protest against the US drone warfare, where we had an amazing trial in Nevada. She's been nominated many times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Kathy, don't listen to any of this, but everybody, I really encourage you to look Kathy Kelly up and read just the outlines of her work on Wikipedia, because it's so stunning. It's a long list of countless trips to war zones and peace projects around the world and protest and jail stints. And as you may have read, that when in 1999, I was the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, I asked Kathy to coordinate our delegation of Nobel Peace Prize winners to Iraq to study the sanctions, which killed hundreds of thousands of children under 5. And for me and Mairead Maguire and Adolfo Perez Esquivel, it was one of the most powerful experiences of our lives. And I remember walking down the streets of Baghdad with Kathy in the midst of all the evil that the United States was doing, and people coming up on the streets and greeting her. And that everybody, I had the sense that everybody in Baghdad knew there was one American who stood with them and who loved them. And it was one of the great teachings of my life, because Kathy shows me what it means to live the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and how to love our enemies. So, dear friends, give a big round of applause by shaking your hands, and let's welcome our friend and teacher, Kathy Kelly. Welcome, Kathy. The floor is yours.
Oh, well, John, thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you for starting the Beatitudes Center and for welcoming me here today. I'm so pleased to see each person on the call, and I feel a great deal of gratitude for all of the companionship that's so needed, because as John has stated, we're in grim and in dark times. And so I gave us a title for some thoughts today: Abolition of War, another way of saying blessings. And if you can imagine my 18-year-old self having gone into St. Benet's bookstore in downtown Chicago during the pretty dark times of the Vietnam War, and seeing a poster by Corita Kent that said "Springtime, another way of saying blessings." And so I thought, well, abolish war, another way of saying blessings. What a good fortune it would be if we could actually do so. So I'd like to begin by turning to Mother Earth for just a little clip that in a way says it all. I so hope that the audio clip will work. I found this, I guess the Smithsonian Museum has it preserved. And on the 11th minute of the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month of 1918, when finally the guns and the explosions and the chemical warfare and the horrible, horrible destruction of World War I came to a declared end, there's an audio clip of the seconds that transpire as the explosions end. You can hear it, and then you hear silence, and then listen carefully. I really hope this will work, okay? I'm going to share my screen, share sound, and then I want to... Oh no. Dickhead.
How's it going, Kathy?
Can you see this?
No, we can't see the screen.
Oh no, sorry.
You did it before. You were able...
I'm so sorry. Let me try this again.
Yeah. Okay, we can see it now.
Oh, okay. Thank you for your patience. I'm so sorry. Okay. And so, my friends, abolish war, another way of saying blessings. And there's that bird that can still speak to us of the sanity in stopping the weapons. Jim Forrest was a mentor to so many people on this call and in the peace movement and through the Catholic Worker. And toward the end of his fine, good life, he, a couple of times, encouraged me to pay attention to artwork. And I was joking with John, that it took COVID and all these Zoom calls to pull me kicking and screaming into the 21st century. But I am grateful that now I do tend to look more for visual images that sort of augment what it seems so important to try and say. So I'd like to ask you to join me in reaching way back into the 16th century. And, I'm no art historian. I don't even know if I pronounce things right, but I want to show you a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder. And I think he was such a brave painter because he decided to show the full impact of a group of soldiers on horseback riding into a defenseless village. And the title of the painting was The Massacre of the Innocents. So I'll just pull this painting up. Are you seeing it? Okay. Well,
Yeah.
it's a very complicated painting in many ways because there's so much going on and much of it is violence. But I want to draw attention certainly to the soldiers on horseback. And then you see a lot of interactions going on with the soldiers. And, it's clear that people are trying to protect things, protect themselves. But the interesting thing about this painting is that it was acquired in 1604 by the Emperor Rudolph II. And he was very impressed by this famous artist's capacity to paint, but he wasn't so impressed by making it seem as though soldiers were slaughtering babies. And so he covered over the images of children with bundles of food or turkeys or images that made it seem like the soldiers might be engaged in plunder, but they weren't massacring children. And I believe that there's a real strong message in our time as well that comes from Peter Bruegel's work, because we also, perhaps not so clumsy as the emperor assigning his painters to go and paint over the original, but we have ruling classes, we have elected officials, and we have the Pentagon, the Department of Defense regularly covering over the realities of United States warfare in a time of permanent war. And particularly, we've seen that again and again in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Syria, with the usage of drone warfare. And so I think it is so very, very important for us to continue to try to see the face, the humanity of people who can't escape. And so I'd like to share another very famous painting. This one is by Francisco Goya, and it's called The 3rd of May, 1808. And in 1808, Napoleonic troops had gone into Spain, into Madrid. Spanish loyalists tried to rise up against these troops. They were defeated in a day. But the next day, about 600 people, some of them civilians, there was really no proof that they'd done anything wrong. Some probably were rebels. They were marched outside the city limits and executed. Francisco Goya's painting squarely puts the light and the drawing of our feeling on one of the victims. So I'd like to share my screen with you. And isn't it almost as though the figure with his arms extended is a Christ figure? He's utterly defenseless. There's bloodshed and prayer and mourning and lamentation going on. You see the fear in his face. And really, when you look at the image of the soldiers, it's almost as though they're a clump. They don't really look so much like human beings. You don't see any faces. In fact, their legs almost might appear like a large arachnid's spider legs. But there we have the image that Francisco Goya clearly wanted us to see of a human being whose life will be ended by the merciless weaponry and those who shoot. And so I wanted to recall that to mind because there are ongoing, continual efforts by fine and wonderful artists to show us the faces, the innocent faces. And so the next image I'd like to take us to was something that was developed in 2010. This is a field, an agrarian field in a rural area. You can see how simple the buildings are, right? And what the artist did was develop a way of creating such an enlarged image of an innocent little Pakistani girl's face that actually this is what the drone would see flying above if a weaponized drone were flying over that particular complex. And there had been so many drone strikes against people in what was called the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area that they wanted to kind of speak back by creating this image. And it's very telling to me because the author named it Not a Bug Splash. Because sometimes the military parlance that drone operators use when they actually hit a target and they can see this pool, that person's body becomes a pool that emanates heat and is visible, they call it bug splat. And they sometimes call the people who run away squirters. So it's so very, very important for us to, in our time, recognize the tremendous humanity of people. And so I also wanted to draw our attention to someone whom I regard as a very brave artist. He's a professor now in New York, Professor Wafa Bilal. And some of you in Santa Fe may have known him when he was a very, very young man. He lived there and then he came to Chicago and he was at the Art Institute. And Wafa Bilal did a very, very unusual art installation. He installed himself in a cubicle at an art gallery near the Art Institute in Chicago. And he set up a paint gun, which remotely could be aimed at him. And anybody who got online and knew about this project could shoot the paint gun. And he wrote a book about it called Shoot an Iraqi. They could basically shoot him with a paintball. He stayed in that cubicle for a month. And over 60,000 people took a shot at him. Now, others could try to sort of re-pivot the paintball machine remotely and miss shooting him, you know, so that he would be spared having another paintball splat on the wall around the plexiglass shield he had in front of him. He did this in 2007 because in 2005, his brother had been killed by a US aerial weapon. And I would have thought, okay, Wafa, you've made your contribution. Thank you, that's enough now. But he went to New York City, and in 2010, he did another project called And Counting. And you see his bare back there on the screen?
We can't see it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Uh-oh. One moment.
You haven't shared the screen here.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Nope. So it's not shared screen yet.
I see. So John, I'm going to give it one more try. How about now?
Nope.
Oh dear, I am so sorry. I thought I had all these pulled up and ready to roll, but it seems as though for some reason it's not working.
It's okay. We're very nonviolent.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, all right. So there's Wafa Bailal. And you can see it in the background. A woman is reading. She's reading her portion of the list of names, which it took 24 hours to read throughout the day and night. They read the names of people that had been killed in Iraq, and the tattoo artist inscribed those names and the place where the person was killed on Wafa Bailal's back. And you can see little tiny dots, perhaps. And this had to be very painful. The dots represent each Iraqi's name, which then can only be visible when a black light was shown on his back to make them visible. Otherwise, it's indelible ink. But the names of the Americans are written, and those are visible. So I so respect Wafa Bailal for carrying all through his life now the names, the awareness of the consequences of war. John and I had a chance, both of us, to go to Afghanistan. And there were so many ways that you could see a different way of looking at the country, other than what 4 large blimps, which were always hovering over the city, would see. Those 4 large blimps were there for surveillance purposes. And nobody could really escape being surveilled. And they would pick up information about people. There were plenty of drone spy planes that were also flying over the city, and they were missioned or tasked with establishing patterns of life amongst people in Afghanistan, and sometimes establishing high value targets. But I would maintain, and I know anybody who's been to Afghanistan with voices would agree, that the far better way to better understand patterns of life in Afghanistan would be to move into the working class area where a young group of incredible idealists lived and worked. So I only saw Afghanistan through a keyhole, quite honestly. I next to never left that neighborhood. But the kids would sometimes take me to the outskirts of Kabul and shepherd me up the mountainside. I remember with Martha Hennessy going up an icy road, and then there wasn't any road, and we were going up and up and up this mountain because that's where the widows lived. It was cheaper because there was no water, and they were hovels, primitive, no electricity, no latrines, no water, no heat, and children. Women had children to care for. And so my young friends would do surveillance. Let's call it surveillance, not with a blimp, not with a drone, but with a notepad and a pen. They would, crunch down, crawl in practically to these hovels, sit down, and with utter respect for the woman and her children, ask questions. Madame, can you tell me, please, how many times a week does your family have meat? And as I recall, that was never. How often do you eat beans? And that might be 2 or 3 days a week if they were lucky. And how do you get your water? And women would talk about going either up or down these mountain paths that were no paths, carrying heavy buckets of water, long distances. How does an income get into this family? And if the answer to that question was a child under the age of 12, then that survey would go to the top of the list, to the top of the deck. And there were so many children whose mothers had to send them into the marketplaces to pick up scraps off the ground to try to bring home something for the family. So my young friends, themselves having come from also situations of great poverty and primitive living situations, they organized a way to get Westerners to help by purchasing this kind of kryptonite green fleece, mounds of it. It was synthetic. And then coverlet material. And I swear every woman in Afghanistan knows how to make these heavy blankets. They showed me how to do it. I literally fainted. You have to thump them with a baseball bat to flatten out the fleece, and I was out. But they're very life-saving blankets because they're so heavy and so warm. And if you don't have those blankets, honest to God, you could be so cold you could die of hypothermia. And that happened to children. So then they would distribute, they would collect the blankets from the women and then get these rickety old lorries. John will remember all this. And then they'd stack the blankets up and pray the lorry didn't tip over. And then they would go to the refugee camps, the squalid, desperate refugee camps, and distribute those heavy blankets free of charge. Abolish war, another way of saying blessings, what we can free up in ingenuity, idealism, capacity, funding, sharing resources, collaborating, if we get rid of this terrible, horrid onus of war making. So I'll try to share my screen again, but if it doesn't work, I'm going to give up. Are you able to see this? Okay, so these are images from that duvet project.
All we see is the Voices for Creative Nomads. Oh, there we can see the duvet.
All right, so those are the women carrying these heavy blankets on their heads and trying to assemble in the snow and keep the blankets clean. And it was never easy, but they had just made those blankets. And, you know, if you can imagine them in, you know, very, very cold circumstances when they'd want to be wearing mittens, carefully sewing those coverlets. And they were stored everywhere. In every nook and cranny, you'd see these kind of burgeoning heaps of heavy blankets. And there's our friend Khalida, very patiently distributing the green fleece to each of the people. The mothers would sometimes bring their children with them to help them carry things. And that's the truck. It only tipped over once when I was there, but I would really be so anxious for whoever was sitting on top of the heaped up blankets. And then often mosques would help the kids figure out how to do the distribution. It was tense, you know, because everybody wanted a blanket. And so they arranged 30 to the Hazaras, 30 to the Pashto, 30 to the Uzbek and Tajik people, so that there was a 30% fairness in distribution. And so this was a project that got really hundreds and hundreds and then thousands of heavy blankets over the course of about 4 or 5 winters into the homes of people who were very, very needy. I just want to mention one other memory of mine from Afghanistan. There's a wonderful group called the Emergency Surgical Center for Victims of War. John, I wonder if you went over there and donated blood when you were in Kabul, the Italian hospital. And I remember meeting a nurse, Emanuele Nannini, had introduced me to a male nurse who was one of the people who would strap a big, heavy, I mean, really heavy backpack on his back. And he would walk as far as he could after an emergency ambulance had dropped him off, so that he could get to one of the 41 clinics they ran in very, very far off areas. And the emergency surgical center vehicles were always safe because they had that logo, and that logo, it looks like the Euro sign almost. It meant to people, these are the people who will sew anybody up. They don't ask any questions, and they don't allow any guns in their hospitals, and they care in so many practical ways about impoverished people. So he walked to where it was a meeting point, and it was going to be his last time doing a mission like this because he was going to go back to Italy. And he said that villagers, 80 villagers had walked 4 miles in the deep snow to come and say goodbye to him. And he said to me, Allah, yeah, I fall in love that day. Allah, I fell in love that day. And that's why Beatitudes, blessings, come with abolishing war. It ushers in love, real love, love for the people who could so gladly live in harmony with us, who mean us no harm. You know, John mentioned the freezing of Afghanistan's economy and these economic sanctions being placed on them, not unlike the terrible economic sanctions that afflicted people, particularly children in Iraq. And there's not a single Afghan person who attacked the United States in 9/11. And yet they've been punished in an illegal, immoral war for all these years. And now the punishment is sort of morphing into an economic form of warfare, because even if President Biden says, oh, we're putting $3.5 million into an account that will, get this word down, eventually be used to parcel out, to dole out humanitarian relief, the need is now. There are 1 million Afghan children who might not survive this winter because they're so hungry and so vulnerable to other diseases. 23 million people facing acute malnourishment this winter. The need is now. And the United States has no right to those funds. That is the fund that belongs to Afghan people from the Afghan Central Bank, and all the humanitarian relief in the world isn't going to restart the Afghan economy. It's near collapse. It's as though the United States went out, turned off the generator, took the key and threw it away, and went on its way. So people are facing enormous, enormous troubles. But my young Afghan friends that most recently wrote to me, I and some friends managed to send them a pittance of help. And they wrote back, thank you for hearing our Afghan pain. That was a Kalal. Thank you for hearing our Afghan pain. There was a film that was made that I believe it aired in 2015 called National Bird. And Sonia Kennebec made this film, very talented young woman filmmaker who traveled to Afghanistan many times. And this film shows the drone camera footage of a drone attack that had attacked a group of people who were villagers. They were actually on their way to the capital city of Kabul. It was like a huge event in their lives. I mean, women sometimes, never could leave their household, or, just the very confines of the village. And now they were going to Kabul. This was really, really exciting. And they were going in a 3-car convoy, and they were bringing with them turkeys to give to their relatives in Kabul. But you sometimes hear the words confirmation bias describing what happens when drone operators begin to get more and more convinced that they're confirming that these are dangerous people, these are terrorists. And so this convoy was being under surveillance because a group of US paratroopers had landed on a nearby mountainside, and they got very nervous. They thought, uh-oh, here come 3 cars, and these people might kill the paratroopers. What are we going to do? And ultimately, the decision was made. The order was given, impact. And 2 of the cars were completely blown to smithereens. And then the drone operators realized, oh, those were human beings, children, women, non-combatants that we just killed. And so I think it's so very, very important for us to continue to understand that those kinds of drone attacks had become routine in Afghanistan. After the terrible, terrible suicide bombing at the Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 23rd, the United States, I mean, President Biden said, "We will hunt you down. We will find you." It was a very vengeance-filled statement. And certainly it was a terrible, ghastly attack, so wrongful. 13 US Marines were killed, and there were 170 Afghans killed on that day. And so the United States military was very intent on finding the perpetrator and finding the next possible bomber. And so they began for 8 hours to follow a man named Zemarai Ahmadi. He was driving a white Toyota Corolla. Well, there are a lot of white Toyota Corollas in Afghanistan. Everybody, I don't know how to drive, but most of my car driving friends noticed that right away. And, in all the years that I went back and forth to that little neighborhood in Kabul, I never knew anyone who owned a car. So Zemarai Ahmadi has the company car. He worked for Nutrition and Education International, a California-based company. And he had worked for them for 6 years. And, he was a very trusted worker. And he had a visa to take him and his family to the United States, possibly the very next day. And on August 29th, Zemarai Ahmadi was busy doing all kinds of chores. He dropped off his boss's computer because the boss had forgotten the computer at home. He picked up big, huge canisters of water because the neighborhood has got a drought going on, and he wanted to get water to his neighbors and his family. He dropped off a few coworkers. The previous day he'd been busy going to refugee camps, creating a kind of a soup kitchen distribution. The sky was golden when it came to getting tasks done. And he thinks it's his last day in Kabul because he's going to the United States. So when he pulled into the driveway of the family home or courtyard, they had a tradition that when Dad came back with the family car, well, actually the company car, he let one of the kids park it. Well, this was like a big deal. So all the kids come pouring out and squealing and giggling. The confirmation bias that the drone analyst had established was that he wasn't picking up water canisters. He was gingerly placing explosives in the back trunk of the car. They convinced themselves that he had gone not to his boss's office, but to an ISIS safe house. They convinced themselves that he must be eliminated before he did something terrible. And so the order was given, impact. And a Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile, 100 pounds of molten lead, landed on the car. In the last 2 minutes of the video, you could see a child in the video that the drone camera was picking up, but it was too late. So I'd like to say that all of us, have a responsibility to join together and not to look away. And so I'd like to share my screen again and ask you to join me in an effort not to look away. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So we're looking at Zemarai Ahmadi, 43 years old. And he worked as the only breadwinner for the entire extended family. And I suppose when he was about 20 years old, he gave birth to this, his wife gave birth to this young man. This is Zamir Ahmadi, 20 years old. You can see the very hip haircut on the young boy. And this is Zamir's younger brother, Faisal, age 16. And there you have Farzad, age 10. You can imagine a smile on his face, huh? And they're the two nephews of Zemarai Ahmadi. Benjamin, age 6, Arwin, age 7. And these are the little girls. For some reason, I look up drones so often that I can't get this darn drone advertisement off my page, but this is Hayat, age 2, and Somaya and Malika are both age 3. And there's the beautiful family. And they're still in Afghanistan. By the time October 15th had come and gone, they had not yet heard one word from the United States military, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of State. They were begging to be evacuated, and they're still begging for that. There's a California-based NGO's director, who's the director of that Nutrition and Education International, Dr. Steve Kwan, and he's very vocal and brave, I think, in saying this is a scandal. So we bear this responsibility not to look away. But I want to say that it's not only important in terms of how it affects people in Afghanistan, but my friends, when the United States just, says, oh, well, that war's over with, on to the next one, as John had mentioned, possibly with Ukraine. Well, that means they're going to look for more weapons. And of course, $740 billion could never be enough in 1 year to pay for all the weapons that the Department of Defense seeks. And so now they're talking about, in a war with China, the only way the United States could really get the upper hand, because China has such vast capacity scientifically, technologically, the only way the US could get the upper hand after they've gone through war game after war game after war game is for the US to, and this is General Charles Richard saying this, to have recourse to using nuclear weapons. That in the event of a military engagement with China, he said, having recourse to nuclear weapons would become a probability, not a possibility. The nuclear threshold being approached while they hold the China card as though there's no possibility for collaboration or global solidarity or working on climate catastrophe and pandemic and nuclear weapon proliferation together. No, this obsolete political class that only seems to be able to adhere to dying and nauseous concepts of global relations could plunge us all into total disaster. And, General Sami Saeed was the Air Force general given responsibility to investigate. They always investigate themselves, to investigate what happened to the family of Samarai Ahmadi. And what they came up with as the conclusion was no wrongdoing, no accountability, nothing was done wrong. And General Sami Saeed said, well, you've got to look at the context. There was this terrible attack at the airport. We had to try to stop a next attack. And okay, I would grant that context, but I think we have to push back, get a much broader, deeper context. And to do that, I appeal to Daniel Hale. Daniel Hale, another way of saying blessings, actually, another way of saying abolish war. Daniel Hale was a nuclear whistleblower. I'm sorry, forgive me, a drone whistleblower. And he risked his life to get materials to Jeremy Scahill, a good friend to many of us on this call, so that there could be a disclosure of the fact that 95% of the time, the people that were chosen as high value targets were victims of faulty intelligence. They were innocent non-combatants. And he was sentenced, Hale was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He's in the Marion Penitentiary now. And at his sentencing statement, he said, Your Honor, forgive me, I stole papers, but it was because I could no longer steal what it was not mine to take, the lives of innocent people. So I'll hopefully share screen just one more time, because I wanted us to see this image of Daniel Hale. It was projected onto a wall in Washington, D.C., and underneath it are the words, "Pardon Daniel Hale." And I find this picture so compelling because there are people out having a good time. This is pre-COVID, bright lights, big city, and There's that kind of haunting image, pardon Daniel Hale. And so in a way, I guess I want to say, may we all be pardoned. May we be pardoned for our inability to put an end to war and sometimes not exercising the same kind of courage that Daniel Hale exercised. But I think that word abolition, I'm going to make a prediction, is going to come more and more into the parlance of people, even well beyond our circles. You know, we live in a country that didn't eradicate all of the consequences of slavery or the practices of human trafficking. And I know our prison industrial complex is another form of enslavement. But in the history of the United States, there was the abolition of the institution of buying and selling human beings at the marketplace. We can do it. And believe it or not, I was on a Zoom yesterday with New Yorkers and artists and people. I'm usually not part of that crowd at all, but they were having a museum, Highline Museum, a symposium about drone warfare. And I was amazed. These young artists, filmmakers, sculptors, people who have distinguished themselves in many different professions, they were using the word abolition to say they wouldn't settle for anything other than abolition of these military systems. So abolish war. Another way of saying blessings. We on this call have all felt the blessing of companionship, of joint effort, of desiring, wanting it so badly you can taste it, an end to the various abuses that are created by military systems. And so to recognize that in some ways militarism has become the dominant religion of the United States, we now can be steered by the goodness of the Beatitudes, steered by the rudder of the Beatitudes, to say this is our good luck, it's our good fortune, to be pulled into and drawn toward abolishing war forever. So thank you for listening to all of that. I'm so eager to get your questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Everybody, how about a show of hands to thank Kathy Kelly for your very moving and touching presence?